everyone. Welcome to the Bedford Historical Society Speaker Series.
The Bedford Historical Society Speaker Series is supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, and also in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Ohio Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, or the Bedford Historical Society.
But now I would like to introduce Sara Fisher. She's with the International Women's Air and Space Museum. Now, I welcome Sara to give us some information on the space program.
Excellent. Thank you so much for welcoming me and by extension the International Women's Air and Space Museum this evening. So my name is Sara Fisher. I'm the executive director, and this is just one of the programs in our Speakers Bureau series. So we have programs that just give you kind of that big bird's eye, pun intended, view of women's history in air and space. We also have women in World War II aviation, a brief history of the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. We have our Quest for the Stars program, which this program this evening, Hidden No More, actually grew out of as well. We are constantly researching and hearing from our public in our communities what really interests them, because women in air and space and their history is tied to every single era of modern history, including ballooning. If you watched the Olympics opening ceremony, you might have noticed that the torch cauldron for the Olympic flame was actually in a balloon, which is a nod to the late 18th century pioneers of aviation. And there was a woman, Sophie Blanchard, who also was a French woman, and she was among the first women to pilot a balloon back in 1805. So there are so many more stories to tell, but this evening we are just going to explore just some of the stories of women who shaped our collective and growing and ever-evolving space program. So just show of hands, how many of you have heard of the International Women's Air and Space Museum? Okay, perfect, wonderful. So the majority of you. So you may already know what our mission is, but we are the only museum of its kind in the world dedicated to sharing the stories and experiences of all women in all areas of air and space. Everyone knows the name Amelia Earhart, right? Yes. If you haven't, I ask you what planet you came from and are visiting from. So we all know Amelia Earhart, but how many of you have heard of Bessie Coleman? Okay, those of you who actually visited the museum and looked at our exhibits, you don't get to answer anymore. But yes, please do. I love participation. So we share the stories of Bessie Coleman, the first African-American woman to earn her pilot's license. She actually earned her pilot's license a year before Amelia did. We share the stories of Pearl Young, who you will learn about this evening, who is the first woman to be hired professionally by NACA, NASA's predecessor. We share the stories of data analysts, of air traffic controllers, of aviation mechanics, of pilots, of astronauts. Last year, as part of our guest speaker series, we welcomed retired NASA astronaut Kathy Sullivan, who was among the first 6 female astronauts selected by NASA in 1978. She came to share her experience and what the future of the space program is shaping up to look like. So we are a plucky little organization. I am currently the only staff member to oversee all of our programs, our collections, which we also received support from the National Endowment for the Humanities to update our collection storage over the past 2 years. So I actually presented on that this morning at a conference. So for those of you who are unfamiliar or haven't yet visited, I encourage you to come visit us in downtown Cleveland. We are located inside Burke Lakefront Airport, which is the official reliever airport for our very own Cleveland Hopkins International. Our offices, gift shop, research center are housed there, and you can explore our exhibits at everyone's favorite price point, for free. 7 days a week from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. for self-guided tours. So it's a pick your own adventure. Our exhibits take up 2/3 of the concourse area, but we do offer guided tours where you can take a deeper dive. You can get that opportunity to really ask questions live and engage with one of our trained docents. You can see here just some of the exhibits that we have, and one of them, it is now open. Forgot to update this slide, but is now open, which is Around the World, which shares the stories and experiences and the backgrounds of women even as far back as 1928 who circumnavigated the world, all in homage, in honor of Ohioan Jerry Mock's success 60 years ago, being the first woman to solo around the world, and Joan Merriam Smith, who became the first woman to solo around the equator, which is about 5,000 more miles than Jerry's. So we have a lot of stories to tell, and we also are regularly rotating. So you can see this image here is from our Quest for the Stars exhibit, which we have that program. And also this program this evening is diving into just more of these women's stories. We do host upcoming events. So our next event is the night before the Cleveland National Air Show, and it is our Corks on the Concourse. So engage in some great wine samples from local wineries. We have a silent auction, a raffle, beautiful sunsets. This is actually the sunset from last year. I didn't put a filter on it. That is the sunset that we see every year at Corks, and you can also see some of the participants and the aircraft that are coming in for the air show that starts the following day. So if you are interested in staying up to date on any of our events, programs, just news around the museum, you can scan this QR code on your smartphone, and you can easily get signed up for our once-a-month e-news. So that's the boilerplate information. Now for the main event. So this evening, we are going to just broaden our understanding of women's diverse roles in our space program. What we associate with the space program, we might think of, landing on the moon. We might think of the International Space Station. But the women's diverse roles goes even farther back into history. And we're also going to share some of these women's stories. This is by no means, full disclaimer, this is by no means an all-inclusive program, because I could teach a college-level semester-long class just on the women that we're talking about this evening, but we have a very limited amount of time. So if you want to learn more about any of these women, I have my card, please reach out, and I'd love to connect with you and share some of those additional resources if you're wanting to learn more. All right, so to get started, pop quiz, because remember, I like participation. What year was NASA established? I heard a 60-something, so I heard a 60-something. What was your?
I'm going to say 1950.
All right, so we're kind of like in the middle of the 1960-something and the 1950. So it's also a trick question. Understanding NASA. NASA, as its own entity, did not exist until 1958. But it grew out of another organization, another body that was funded by the US government, and that was NACA. NACA stands for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. And NACA, you can see the logo up there on your right, was actually established in 1915. What's happening at that time? World War I, right? So World War I, quick side quest here. World War I is considered our first modern war. The first time planes were used in warfare. The last time horses were used in warfare. The introduction of the machine gun, of chemical warfare, of tanks. Everyone knows General Patton of World War II fame. He led a tank battalion during World War I. World War I was our first modern war. So it definitely made sense that the US government said, we need to explore and expand our understanding of aviation, and what better time than what's happening in Europe before the US got involved. So for about 40 years, NACA was conducting aeronautical research, experiments, test flights, simulations, and led US advances during World War I, as well as the 1920s, 1930s, the interwar years, and World War II, and the beginning of the Cold War. In total, there were only 4 NACA sites. One was in Langley, Virginia, which once NASA was established became NASA Langley. There were 2 in California. One would become NASA JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And where do we think the 4th one was?
Not the Lewis Research Center. Houston.
Lewis Research Center. Yes.
My mom used to work there.
Oh, Ed, okay. Bury the lead, Paul. Bury the lead. Goodness. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more. But yes, so Lewis Center, you may now know that as NASA Glenn Research Center in Brook Park / Cleveland / right next to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. And all 4 of those sites were conducting different elements of our exploration into aviation and aeronautics, everything that's happening within Earth's atmosphere. But something big happened in 1957. What's happening in 1957, folks? Sputnik, yes. In 1957, Sputnik officially launched. If you read the book Rocket Boys or watched the movie adaptation of the book Rocket Boys, October Sky, you know that it changed our understanding as a society here in the US. So what does our government do? Well, because of these tensions really heating up in the Cold War and the successful launch of Sputnik, the US government decided, okay, we now have a new front that we need to be aware of. We need to expand now. And in 1958, NACA became NASA. So not only focusing on innovation that's happening in Earth's atmosphere, we have to be aware of what's happening outside for our own national security. And from 1958 up through the mid-70s, NASA was aligned lockstep with the Pentagon and our national security concerns. In 58 was also when the first group of male astronauts were selected and announced, known as the Mercury 7. You may know one Ohio chap who was part of the Mercury 7. All together now, John Glenn. Yes. So there were 7 men. All of them were military test pilots, and all of the applications for all 100 applicants, or as they say now, ASCANs, astronaut candidates. I find it that's one of the funniest words I've ever learned in the past year. They all were vetted and nominated and supported by the Pentagon because of their military background. So it wasn't until the 1970s that we start to see a shift after the US emerged as the triumphant in the space race. So all of that is trying to set the stage. So now we know from 1915, it was NACA. 1958 to present is NASA. And all of this is creating like a powder keg of opportunity for women in our space program. And the first woman actually to be hired by NACA as a professional. And professional meaning not a secretary, not what we consider an administrative assistant, not a, this was early phones, but she was a physicist, and her name was Pearl Young. So Pearl Young was actually born in 1895 in Minnesota and raised in Rugby, North Dakota. At age 11, she actually left home to work in the homes of others as a domestic worker, earning enough money to attend high school, which also, this was very still common at the time, especially in more rural areas. It was very common from a young age, young girls especially, to go and work in others' homes as housekeepers, as nannies, as, the gopher, whatever they needed. As a young adult, she continued her education and work at the University of North Dakota, where she actually worked as an assistant in the physics department in the U.S. Weather Bureau. Now again, this is very abnormal. This is outside the norm for a lot of women at the time, because we're starting to see women engage in more of the STEM disciplines, physics, chemistry, astronomy, in a formal setting, not just I work for an astronomer and I'm documenting, I'm transcribing all of his handwriting using a typewriter. She was a trained physicist. It was very strange at that time, but it is also indicative of the changing times. When she's in college, she was born in 1895. It's in the teens. We're starting to see the influences of World War I. We're starting to see the heavy influences of the women's suffrage movement in the western states, in Wyoming, in Montana, in the Dakotas, and that's starting to impact how even UND, the University of North Dakota, was admitting their students. Upon graduation with a degree in physics, mathematics, and chemistry, I need her as a tutor, in 1919, she accepted a faculty position in the physics department at UND. So they saw something in her. It's like, we can't lose her. She needs to stay here and be a teacher and really be that driving force in providing education for students. So again, I just want to really drive this home. All of this is before women in the US got the right to vote. All of this was happening. Her accomplishments were also at the same time that women were working in supportive roles during World War I. We know there's so much about World War II history. Many of our parents, our grandparents, our uncles, our aunts, they all have a tie into World War II history, so we know so much about it. But women were doing a lot of the same work during World War I. At the same time that Pearl Young was beginning her faculty position at UND, Bessie Coleman and Amelia Earhart were starting to hear stories of Canadian servicemen and American servicemen from the U.S. Expeditionary Force coming back home and describing what it was like to see planes fly overhead for the first time. So by 1922, Pearl Young actually joined the 7-year-old NACA site at Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, where she worked in the instrumentation division. By accepting the position at NACA Langley, she became the first professional woman to work for NACA. During her tenure, she became a technical editor and wrote the Style Manual for Engineering Authors, which would become the standard for the agency well into the NASA era. So her legacy lived on into our earliest space program. Not only was she a gifted teacher, physicist, and mathematician, she was also a journalist, having also worked during World War II as a reporter and editor of the Norfolk Ledger-Dispatch newspaper. In 1943, she left Langley for work at the NACA Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory. Where do we think that was? Cleveland, at what is now NASA Glenn Research Center. After the war, she accepted a position in the Pennsylvania State University system teaching physics. And she continued the rest of her professional career at Penn State. So she is one of those first women who started to demonstrate to many, many other young women who were just, honestly, if we could test her IQ, she would be considered a genius, in my humble opinion. But showing that there are ways to work within the system, and you don't have to become a pilot. She never became a pilot from our research, but she was fascinated with our universe and understanding and shaping how we understand aeronautics and advance that during the Second World War. Another woman who was working behind the scenes, and her story, she is just slightly younger than Pearl Young, is Mary Golda Ross. Have any of you heard of Mary Golda Ross before? Have any of you seen the 2019 US commemorative dollar coin that commemorates and celebrates, acknowledges the impact of Native Americans to our society? She's on that coin. That's Mary Golda Ross. So now you're gonna look through all of your spare change and everything in your car, in your dresser. I guarantee I have a lot of change in my coat pockets because why not? But Mary Golda Ross was born in 1908 near the capital of the Cherokee Nation in Park Hill, Oklahoma. She was actually the granddaughter of the Cherokee chief. Now, 1908, the Department of the Interior actually earlier this week just released its full study on the residential schools in the United States for Native Americans. So she was born in 1908 and was still experiencing this push to kill the Indian, save the man, to try to Americanize these young Native children, to assimilate them into American society and understanding. So that actually, from her earliest years through her education and her career, which I'll talk about here in a little bit more depth, she rejected her Native heritage. She pushed it to the side. She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to engage with it at all. But that's setting the mindset for her. This is how she was assimilated and socialized. But she went on and she actually graduated from the Northeastern State Teachers College in 1928 in Oklahoma with a degree in mathematics. 1928, and then the stock market crashed and entered the Great Depression. And Mary Golda Ross, like many of the women who shaped our earliest space program, actually took teaching jobs in the public schools to earn money to support their family, to support themselves. So for 10 years, she taught in those public schools before completing her master's in mathematics from Colorado State Teachers College, which is now the University of Northern Colorado. During World War II, she got a job at the Lockheed Corporation. And in 1942, she was assigned to fix the design problems with the P-38 Lightning aircraft. She helped analyze the data and make the calculations that would stabilize this newer aircraft at higher speeds. World War II saw the beginning of our modern jet age. World War II and all of the technological advances, for good or bad, influenced our earliest actual space program through Mercury. After World War II ended, Lockheed was very pleased with everything that she had done, was willing to invest in her, and they actually sent her to UCLA to get some additional certification to officially become an engineer. And in 1952, after completing that certification, she joined Lockheed's Skunk Works, a top secret think tank where she was a founding engineer and the only woman. And in doing so, she became the first female aeronautical engineer Native American female aeronautical engineer. A lot of adjectives, I apologize. She would work for Lockheed's missile and space program, formed as a result of the Cold War. Remember, all of this is happening before Sputnik. All of this is happening before NASA became NASA and the Mercury 13 and Ohioans John Glenn. While working for the Missile and Space Company, she would work on several key projects, including the submarine-launched Polaris missile and the Agena launch vehicle that carried military, intelligence, and civilian payloads into space, as Lockheed would become one of the primary contractors for NASA into the 1960s and at the height of the space race. The Agena rocket was used to also launch the Corona reconnaissance satellites, and during the Gemini program, it served as a target vehicle for astronauts to practice skills such as rendezvous and docking, which would be necessary during the Apollo era. She was also one of the authors of NASA's Planetary Flight Handbook, Volume 3, which talked about space travel to Mars and Venus. And as the Artemis program advances and we start to plan 50 years into the future, I wonder if they're going to look back at what Mary Golda Ross helped to co-author and develop as we're looking to Mars for a human space flight. Now, she actually retired from Lockheed at age 65. She continued to pursue her interest in engineering, actually, by encouraging young women to pursue engineering, to pursue STEM. But after retirement, in talking to these young women, that's when she found her second calling. She started to embrace her Native American heritage. She started to understand what she had missed out on and see the younger generation. And this is when she retired. This was also during the American Indian movement of the 70s. That she began networking and hosting workshops and seminars and opportunities to encourage Native American youth to explore STEM, to explore and dream about how they can walk in both worlds and pursue their dreams. She actually died in 2008, just shy of her 100th birthday. And that is why in 2019, the U.S. Mint minted the $1 coin that celebrates the significant contributions that Native Americans have had to the history and development of the United States. She was also one of the founding fellows of the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian as well. So her story is one that, I have 2 degrees in history. I knew nothing of her until we started working on one of our exhibits, and I'm like, hold on, I fell down the rabbit hole and I hit every branch on the way down. Her story is one that I absolutely love sharing. And that's what our mission is to share all women's experiences in air and space, because one path is not like the other. Another woman that shaped our space program, she began her career with NACA/NASA officially in 1955. In late 1954, Annie Easley, who you can see here to the right of your screen, she and her husband were actually transplants to Cleveland from, I believe, from South Carolina. And she actually saw in the newspaper an ad for a human computer. Because before we had all the technology in our smartphones, remember pencil and paper and slide rules? Yeah, I kind of sometimes want to go back to that because there's too much technology for me to handle. But she saw this ad in the paper, and she applied for the human computer position at what was then NACA at Lewis Field, now again NASA Glenn Research Center. And 2 weeks later, she was hired and began what would be a multiple decades long career. Her earliest position at NACA was to do mathematical computations for the engineers and scientists in the high security clearance building. She would plot data by hand using a calculator the size of the desk. I have been requesting from our advisors and our friends at NASA Glenn, do you have any of those in your storage room? I would like to see it, would you mind giving it to us? That'd be super. I feel like, especially for all of the kids groups that we have come through, I'm like, I ask, did it take more technology to get us to the moon the first time, or what's in the palm of my hand? Oh, to get us to the moon. Wrong. It took all of the brain power to get us there. But she would use printed tables to find logarithms and exponentials, and I did not do well in pre-calculus, so I'm assuming that's a very good thing. When machine computers were added to the job, she retrained for those early computer punch cards. And you know, if you got one out of sequence, sorry. She would work for the Launch Vehicles Group with a software engineering team, and would actually travel to Cape Canaveral for some of the uncrewed rocket launches during the Centaur, using the Centaur rocket launches. She would also work with many of the early long-term batteries, and work on advancing that technology for battery-powered vehicles. And as a programmer, when she began her career, she was the only African-American woman in her entire department. There are some volunteers and members of the International Women's Air and Space Museum who recently retired from NASA Glenn, in the last 2 years. And when they started their career in the early 80s, Annie Easley was their department manager, was their department supervisor. And she has been described as being that work mom, just coming and checking in on the interns and checking in on folks, and really creating this welcoming, creative environment, and constantly asking questions and challenging folks. She, in an oral history interview, actually, which you can access on NASA's website, NASA's history website, when asked, reflect on your career. What was the thing that stood out? And she said that I'm so grateful to have seen all the things that we can do. So just that power of creativity, that power of innovation and imagination, that just imagine being in her shoes and seeing how space progressed. When she started, there were no astronauts. The term astronaut didn't exist. We didn't land on the moon. We didn't have female astronauts. She saw the progression. She saw the science behind it. So there are some other folks who, they also are recently retired from NASA, and they're like, oh yeah, she was in our ski club. She would race us down the hill. They would go to Brandywine, and I'm like, okay, there's so much to this woman to unpack. But another woman who helped to shape our history has a direct Ohio connection. Not necessarily a transplant, which we welcome transplants, but Dorothy Vaughan. How many of you watched the movie Hidden Figures? Mm-hmm. Or read the book by the same name? Okay. In the movie, she is played by the incomparable, the amazing Octavia Spencer. But Dorothy Vaughan, her story very much it's eerie how it is rather parallel to Marigold Ross's story. But Dorothy Vaughan, she attended Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, it's in Xenia, Ohio, which is Ohio's only historically black college or university. It's still around. They have a very small class, but it is still around. But she, like Marigold Ross, got a degree in mathematics. And then the Depression hit, and she began teaching math in the public schools to support her family because she was married and had small children at the time. In 1941, during World War II, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial, religious, and ethnic discrimination in the defense industry. But in many parts of the country, state and local Jim Crow laws largely remained in place. So she was very hesitant about how she would serve during the war, what activities she would do, because even in Ohio, to put this into some additional context, Xenia is in Greene County, Ohio. The county bordering it just to the north is Clark County. Both of them very rural settings, very agricultural based. Clark County had the highest enrollment in the KKK during the 1920s and 1930s. So it was a very tense time. The highest enrollment in the Midwest states. So she and her husband relocated during the war, and because of the demand for mathematicians, she actually saw an ad like Annie Easley in the paper, but at the Langley Aeronautical Lab in Virginia, and she applied. And in 1943, she was hired to work in the segregated West Area Computing Group at Langley, where her supervisors were white women. Her skills as a computer were in high demand to calculate drag and lift of the aircraft, and used all the same analog tools to calculate all of the very dense math. After 6 years, she was actually promoted to lead an all-black group of female computers, becoming NACA's first black supervisor, male or female, and only one of a few female supervisors. Everything that okay, I can't say everything, but 92% of what you saw in the movie and you read in the book about Dorothy Vaughan, nail, meat, head of hammer, hitting it on the head there. Within the newly formed Analysis Computation Division, once Fortran, that modern mechanized computers came into play, she did retrain. And she actually she didn't work for NASA that long by comparison to others like Annie Easley. She actually retired from NASA in 1971, and in a 1994 oral history interview, she recalled that every day it felt like we were, quote, working on the cutting edge of something very exciting. So imagine being excited to go to work every day and be a part of just dreaming and thinking, what if? What if we do this looking 50 years into the future? And also at this time, by the time that she was retiring from NASA, Star Trek, the original series, had been released. And we know that Gene Roddenberry was talking to NASA scientists. So if you watch the original series and you see what technology we have now, NASA was working on it back in the 60s. And so it's eerie, but also really cool. So if you have kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, friends, kids, have them watch the original series, because they'll be like, that's FaceTime, isn't it? That's a video chat. Wait, how did if they can figure out teleportation, sign me up. I don't like driving a lot. I just can't. A lot of audiobooks. But yet another woman. As we are starting to get into the evolution of our space program, with Mary Golda Ross, with Annie Easley, with Dorothy Vaughan, we saw the baby NASA. We were seeing the evolution, and just kind of like we're throwing noodles at the wall to see what's gonna stick the most. In the late 50s and into the 60s, but as we were starting to get into that decade turnover from the 60s into the 70s, John Glenn, he orbited the Earth. We had, in 63, globally, Valentina Tereshkova of the Soviet Union becoming the first woman to orbit the Earth, the first woman to go to space. She still holds the record over 60 years later as the only woman to solo orbit the Earth. And she is still alive. She was only 19 when she did that. She didn't tell her mom. Her mom had to find out on the radio, and can only imagine the conversation that was had when she got home. But we're starting to see this transition into not just doing suborbital launches, of sending humans to space to go up and then back down. We're starting to see the evolution of orbiting. And then our eyes turn to the moon. And that is when Margaret Hamilton comes into play. How many of you have seen this picture before? Like one or two of you? So this is Margaret Hamilton, and what she is standing next to, that is the code for the security system that Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. if something were to happen and they had to abort mission, that's the code, that's the sequence, that is the software that she's standing next to in paper. So who was Margaret Hamilton? Have any of you guys heard of her before, by the way? Okay, one hand. I mean, if it was that she was enshrined in the National Aviation Hall of Fame last year, congratulations, yes, she was. She was finally enshrined. I'm like, it took us long enough. But for those of you who aren't certain or haven't heard of her yet, Margaret Hamilton was actually born in 1936 in Peloy, Indiana, while studying mathematics and philosophy. It's an interesting, combination. She must have been studying Aristotle and Plato as well. At Earlham College, which is a Quaker school, a Quaker college and university in Richmond, Indiana, she met and married her husband, James. After graduating from Earlham in '58, Margaret taught in area high schools, and then she and her husband eventually moved to Boston. And it's because she accepted a position at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You go from teaching high school to teaching at MIT. While at MIT, she began programming software to predict weather and ultimately contributed to her graduate work in meteorology. So how did she wind up at NASA or on a NASA project? So like Mary Golda-Ross, she was not actually on the payroll for NASA. MIT was a contractor for NASA. So NASA was paying them to do some of the additional experiments and development and everything like that. In the early 60s, she was involved with the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment, or SAGE project, and that was arguably the first US air defense system, leveraging that meteorology background. She would go on to lead a team that was tasked with developing the software for the guidance and control systems of the in-flight command and lunar modules for the Apollo missions. She's credited with actually coining the term software engineer. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in 2010, and, it wasn't last year, 2022. She was enshrined in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. And what was the official title of it? The guidance and control systems. If Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had an issue in the lunar capsule, because Michael Collins stayed in the rocket, she developed the software that it could abort if they were in an uncontrolled spin, if their trajectory was off. They would have to flip this switch, and it would abort that mission and get them back safely. So it was all a question of, hopefully they would not have to actually use it. Another woman, as we were talking about that 1969 landing, was Joanne Morgan. Now, Joanne Morgan, throughout college, worked as a student employee at NASA's Launch Operations Center in Cape Canaveral. She graduated in 1963 from Jacksonville State with a degree in mathematics and began working full-time for the Launch Operations Center. She was working on planning the instrumentation and communication for launch control, how to display data for engineering, and how to test for launch. In 1966, while preparing for a Saturn rocket launch, she was actually sitting at a console in the launch room, in the firing room, and was confronted by the launch supervisor, who said flat out, "We do not allow women in here." She said, "Well, my supervisor said, I need to get all this data from this test simulation to then go back to the engineers, so we were getting it in real time. It's not a delayed type of thing I can just run down the hall." And the supervisor said, "We do not allow women in here." And literally showed her the door. So she went back to her supervisor. He's like, "I don't care what Joey said. Go in there and get my data. We need this to stay on schedule." So that was but the tip of the iceberg for her. But she continued to prove herself. And on July 16th, 1969, the day of the Apollo 11 launch. To her, it felt like the biggest day, or to many, it felt like the biggest day in her career. She was assigned to the A team. That meant that her shift began 3 hours before the launch. She was there running computation. She was making sure the communications and the guidance and control systems were all in working condition. It was a very high stakes, high energy, high tension environment. Only days later, another Ohioan, if you get a chance, please go down to the Armstrong Air and Space Museum in Wapakoneta, Ohio. Tell them Sarah sent you, and they will be like, okay, we'll let you in anyway. They're great. I love them down there. Only days later, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, did it finally hit her. This image here is very, 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 very zoomed in. The zoomed out, the room, 3 times the size of this, Joanne Morgan, and 500 men. She was the only woman in the room. And days after they set foot on the moon, did it finally click? That how amazing is that to be selected for the A team, to be in that room when it launched. And now they successfully landed. So she would continue working for NASA for 45 years in total. She only retired in 2003. She hasn't been out all that long. And she not only was the only woman in the launch room during the Apollo 11 launch, she became the first female at NASA to be awarded the Sloan Fellowship, which is a prestigious grant program through Stanford. And she would become the first NASA female division chief, senior executive at Kennedy Space Center, associate director at Kennedy Space Center, and director of safety and mission assurance at Kennedy Space Center. She actually, I believe it was last month, was down in Columbus for a program, and I believe the Ohio State Connection, or COSI, recorded that program. So I highly recommend checking that out because she was sharing in her own words what her experience was, and I think that has way more impact than me up here trying to do justice to this remarkable woman. So all of this is really leading up to, from our human space program, Apollo. And now we are looking at from Apollo to Artemis, because Apollo 11 was not the first one. But as we're looking at the human space program with our astronauts, remember, NASA is not just let's get people into space, let's understand our universe. How many of you have seen the amazing images that the Webb telescope has recently been sending back of our universe, of all of the different galaxies and solar systems and the star clusters? I'm geeking out and I don't fully understand like how massive our universe is. But the Webb telescope built off of the work of this woman here. How many of you have heard of Nancy Grace Roman? What about the Hubble Space Telescope? Meet the mother of Hubble. It was because of this woman here that we got the Hubble Space Telescope. It was because of this woman here, and the story I'm about to tell you, that retired NASA astronaut Dr. Kathy Sullivan, who's an oceanographer, one of the first 6 female astronauts for NASA, was selected for one of her missions to figure out how do we construct the Hubble Space Telescope in orbit. Her oceanography background was a big factor because water and the oceanic environment mimics space. So let's talk about Nancy Grace Roman for a hot second. She was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and would become the first woman to hold an executive position at NASA, full stop, as the agency's chief astronomer, so all of the NASA sites. She was the first woman to hold that position. As a child, her mother would take her to explore the constellations and see the northern lights and just really engage with our natural world, the elemental world. And she recalled actually just before her death in 2018 in an oral history interview that, quote, "I think I just was fascinated. Between 5th and 6th grades, I organized my friends into an astronomy club to study the constellations. And by 7th grade, I decided I wanted to be an astronomer. And I was going to try for it. I knew it was going to take me another 12 years of schooling, but I figured I'd try it, and if I didn't make it, I could teach physics or math in high school." There's a lot of NASA is a lot about education. And it's just seeing it go back and forth there. But as a 10 and 11-year-old starting an astronomy club, I kind of wish I knew her as a child. But when she joined NASA, she actually served as a program scientist responsible for selling the astronomy program to the higher ups to approve a high-powered telescope. In 1962, the National Academy of the Sciences wanted to send a 9-foot in diameter telescope into orbit aboard one of the Apollo boosters. I am 6 foot tall. Add 3 feet to me. That's how big the lens of the telescope is. Sarah plus 3. The project appealed to NASA Langley, the site responsible for the manned space program at the time. However, folks disagreed on how exactly to get it into orbit. Some argued that they needed to have an astronaut there to put it together, or to be there to administer, to get the long exposure images. But then you have folks from the National Academy for the Sciences and astronomers saying, well, no, because if he hiccups, if he sneezes, if he just has a muscle twitch, the entire exposure, which could be up to 12 hours. That's how long the exposure length is. We know from the cameras, when you hear the click, that's supposed to mimic the aperture closing, so it's clicking to actually capture the image, get rid of the light, all right? Imagine having a 12-hour exposure where you can't close the aperture because it's looking as far as it can go. And someone sneezes. Well, that's a couple $100 million down the tube, in my humble opinion. So this disagreement went on for years. And over the subsequent years, it eventually moved forward. And again, it was on Nancy Grace Roman to convince NASA and the U.S. Congress's Budget Committee to fund the project. So we know about the budget process now. It was not better back in the 60s and the 70s and even into the 80s. But she recalled that one of the stories that she liked to tell is that then Senator William Proxmire, the senator who was noted for laughing at these out of the park projects, these projects that could cost the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars now, would just laugh at them and argue that why would an American taxpayer want to approve this? What would appeal to them? She took that as a challenge, and she actually sat down, got the back of an envelope, and started doing calculations, and came up with the fact that for the price of one night at the movies, each American would receive 15 years of exciting discoveries. She was able to do the math at the time, what's the US population? Break that down to the penny, or even the half penny. So, it worked. And in 2022, the Thomas Webb Telescope launched to space, which was growing out of and expanding on the work that Nancy Grace Roman and her team had done with Hubble. And Hubble helped us understand our cosmos to a certain extent. Webb is taking it that next step. It is the deepest and highest powered telescope to date. The telescope has provided NASA and its international partners, scientists in the world, with the largest astronomical study in the modern era. But in late 2020, 2 years after Nancy Grace Roman's death, NASA announced that it is honoring the mother of Hubble. They are working on another telescope. And the next telescope, the Wide Field Infrared Survey Telescope, is going to be named the Roman Space Telescope in honor of her, as the first woman to serve in the position of NASA chief astronomer and the mother of Hubble. In the announcement just 4 years ago, former Senator Barbara McCloskey, who also worked on Hubble, stated, "It is fitting that we celebrate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. NASA has announced the name of their new W1st, this wide range infrared, like the technical term, telescope in honor of Dr. Nancy Roman, the mother of Hubble. It recognizes the incredible achievements of women in science and moves us even closer to no more hidden figures and no more hidden galaxies." I like to put historical context on things if you guys haven't figured out. When Nancy Grace Roman was beginning her career, when she became chief astronomer, when she was first starting to go to bat to have this 9-foot in diameter telescope, women in the US could not get a credit card in their own name. Their husband had to sign off if they wanted to open a bank account. There's a lot that's happening at this time, but you see her just saying, I'm gonna do this anyway. Like, if I can't be an astronomer, I'll just teach. So that's important to note, that during the 60s and the 70s, it hasn't been, until 1974 was when women could open a bank account on their own and not needing their husband or a male relative in the US to co-sign. It's crazy. But she was still pushing those boundaries. All right, I'm gonna move us along here real quick. So another woman is Mimi Ong. So Mimi Ong is a project manager for JPL, so the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Mars Ingenuity helicopter team. A couple of years ago, did you all hear all of the hubbub about a swatch of the Wright Flyer fabric landing on Mars in the news? There's a swatch, and guess what it was carried on? The Ingenuity helicopter. So a piece of the Wright Flyer of the Wright brothers flew on Mars, and it was thanks to Mimi Ong. Ong was born in Burma and has been with JPL for more than 30 years. Her mother was actually the first woman in Myanmar to receive a PhD in mathematics and the first woman in Myanmar to receive a PhD from the United States. She inherited her love of mathematics and engineering and exploring space. She earned a bachelor's and master's from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in electrical engineering, as it happens. She joined JPL in 1990, and in 2000 she became the project element manager for the autonomous formation flying sensor on the Starlight 2 spacecraft interferometer mission. If anyone can translate that, help. But she applied her knowledge of transmit receiving systems that allowed the team to measure the precision of multiple spacecraft flying simultaneously. And that would come into play for the Ingenuity helicopter, because the gravitational pull on Mars, head and shoulders different than in the US. Head and shoulders different than what's on the moon. So the helicopter, it's not a single rotary. It had, I believe, 2 that were rotating in different directions to get enough lift so it could fly and take the aerial shots of the lunar surface. So Ong and her team actually won the Collins Trophy for Current Achievements in 2022. And the Mars Ingenuity team, under their direction, achieved that first powered flight on another planet. That's huge. And yes, it did carry a part of the right flight. That was actually provided by Dayton History at Carroll Historic Park down in Dayton, Ohio. The Ingenuity was delivered to the surface of Mars by the rover Perseverance and was a technology demonstration to prove that it could happen. Ingenuity was only expected to make 5 flights. How many do you think it flew? How many times? Here's a hint, it's more than 5. 20? What? Okay, I got a 20. What's another one? 40. Okay, what's another one? 50. Okay, now we're going the wrong direction. It's between 20 and 40. But thank you so much for participating and showing that you're still awake. We're almost done, promise. It flew 37 times before officially turning off on December 17th. It launched and landed on Perseverance in February of 2022. And it flew 37 times. So she is shaping the modern age of NASA. She and her team actually worked with a number of different contractors, including Lockheed Martin Space on this project. And all of that is leading into Artemis. Artemis is in Greek mythology, the twin sister of Apollo. And just like her brother did, Artemis is taking humans back to the moon. But this time is different. This time, the mission reflects our more holistic society. For the first time, a woman is going to set foot on the moon. A woman is going to deep space for the first time, meaning outside of the satellite atmosphere. And it was originally slated to be no earlier than fall, like this fall, but now it's no earlier than 2025. They want to make sure everything is working at peak performance. It's a very complicated graphic, but essentially the astronauts on the Orion capsule, which components were developed here in Cleveland and tested here in Cleveland, they are going to launch, and then they're going to slingshot around the Earth, orbit the Earth a few times to make sure that everything is good before taking about the weeks-long path to then slingshot and go around the moon and then come back and land. And what they're doing is they are going to study and they are going to see where we will land on the moon, which is on a different part of the moon than we did during the Apollo missions. The first woman is Christina Koch to go to deep space. She is an electrical engineer. We also have the first person of color with Victor Glover going to space. And then we also have Jeremy Henson, the first Canadian to go to the moon. Victor Glover, the first astronaut of color to go to the moon. And then we have all of them are seasoned veterans of space and have served multiple missions on the International Space Station. And for the Artemis 1 launch, we have Charlie Blackwell Thompson, who was NASA's first ever, full stop, bless you, female launch director for Artemis 1, which was the uncrewed mission in 2021 to test out the capsule and everything, to bring all the data back. So there's so much more that we can dive into, so much more so many more stories that we can tell. That's not just looking at NASA, but it's looking at Axiom. That is looking at Blue Origin, at Lockheed Martin Space, at Virgin Galactic, at Boeing. Sunny Williams flew on their crewed mission. She's still in space, she's doing great. 50 plus days later. It's fine. She's alive, she's thriving, that's all I care about right now. But we can dive into what's this next phase going to be in our space program, and who are the women that are leading the charge, that are working behind the scenes. There's so much more, and that is what we get to look historically. We get to look from our museum standpoint at what's happening now and what does this mean for the next generation and what are the opportunities there. So if you have any questions, I know we're like right at time, a little bit over, but if you have questions, you can email us there. That comes directly to me. You can give us a call. I have my card if you want to schedule a time for a guided tour or anything like that. We would love to welcome you to explore and engage with some of these other stories that we're here to share. So thank you so much for your attention this evening. I really appreciate it.
I was just curious, that picture you had of Margaret Hamilton with the stack of papers. How old was she in that photograph? Because she looks like about 16.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I first saw this, I'm like, wait a second, going back through my notes, when was she born? She was born in 36. She was in her 30s. Wow. She was in her late 30s, actually. Well, no. 36 to, yeah, she was in her mid 30s, so 34, 35, 36 in that range. Yeah. I mean, it's just so, I really want to know what like their skincare regimen was. Maybe it's just having black and white photos. Maybe we should go back to that. It's not like the high definition where I'm like, ugh. I don't know, but she's just very youthful. And maybe that's what teaching on a college campus is. You're just kind of that like youth vampire, like just mooching off of their youth. I know I felt that way when I was a camp counselor back in the day. I'm like, you know what, I'm not that great with 11-year-olds, but by gum, like I feel younger. But yeah, what other questions do we have? Oh, okay.
You didn't mention, but I'm assuming that, like this Joanne Morgan, who was like the first on the A-team, I mean, she was just the first of many, I assume.
She was the first, yes, and that's something that like I in particular struggle with because we focus so much on, well, who was the first? Who was the first woman to circumnavigate the world? Who was the first woman to go to space? And then it's like, okay, but are you talking about first American woman or are you talking about first woman? Because then that starts a whole nother Sarah like side quest. So for Joanne Morgan, she was the only woman in the launch room for Apollo 11, but she was the first. And NASA is slowly like with Joanne Morgan was in the room, but she was not the first female launch director. That's Charlie Blackwell Thompson right here. And that was in 2021. She was the first launch director. Vanessa Weish, Dr. Vanessa Weish is the first female director of Johnson Space Center and the first African-American woman to serve in that position and to serve as the director of any NASA site. And she's currently serving. And I'm trying to get her to come to Cleveland to do a program. I'm trying. We're working on the schedule. But that's the thing. There are a lot of firsts, and we tend to focus in on that. But I look forward to the day where we don't have to say, well, she was the first, or she was the only, to very much like normalize and be able to just make it part of our understanding. Because we're like, okay, who was the first American man to go to space? Okay, that was a bad example. That was a bad example. Of course we know that it was Alan Shepard. And then Yuri Gagarin was the first ever. Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman ever. But then it took about, 18, 19 years for the US to send Sally Ride, but Sally Ride was the third woman to go to space. The Soviet Union heard that, okay, Sally was assigned a mission. We're gonna send up Svetlana Savitskaya and we're gonna have her do a spacewalk too, just to like jab and twist a little bit more. But then in 84, Kathy Sullivan became the first American woman to do a spacewalk. But then it took until 2019 for Christina Cook and Jessica Meir to do an all-female spacewalk. So it was just the two of them out there. So it's like the firsts are important, yes, because it shows it can be done, but let's see if we can replicate that and then make it the norm, where we don't have to define by first, second, only. I'll get off my soapbox. So sorry.
And also, what was the name of that movie and
Yes, okay, which one? Because I talked about two. Are you talking about for Hidden Figures? Yes, so Hidden Figures, it has, that is about Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, about the John Glenn launch. So it has, if anyone's seen Twisters in theaters or have seen the commercials for it, it has a very young Glenn Powell playing the role of John Glenn. I'm like, he hit that, it was very authentic, John Glenn. I'm like, oh, goodness. But there was another book-movie combo adaptation that is about Homer Hickam and just his influence being Werner von Braun and just the impact of Sputnik and then rocketry and how do we, it's just because he was a rural kid from West Virginia. So that the book is called Rocket Boys, but the movie is called October Sky. So, yeah. Any other questions? And I encourage you all to go and grab some cookies, grab some hydration, have some nice networking community time, and I'll be here to answer any questions that you may have. But thank you again so much. You've been wonderful.